Planning a tricky conversation. Now, in this session, I suggest making notes. You can use a sheet of paper or a notebook, or you can copy out or download and print our Planning a Tricky Conversation template, which is available from the online course page. Whenever we're planning a tricky conversation, it's important to bear in mind that we won't always get what we're looking for first time round. Sometimes it takes several conversations to reach an agreement. That's okay. And one way to make sure that everyone wants to continue a series of conversations is to make sure that they always feel comfortable and respected and have a sense of control in those conversations. Number one, what do you want? One of the most challenging questions in a disagreement, dispute or conflict is, what exactly do you want? It can be difficult because people often start a conversation without having the answer clearly in their mind. We can hear, this has to stop, I'm not having that, this needs to be sorted out, or it's not fair. Let's take a step back in time. If we ask ourselves, before we said anything to the other person, what exactly has to stop? What would be okay for me? How would it work once it's sorted out? What will make it fair? Then we'll have a clear idea of what a solution might look like. And it's pointless focusing on a problem with no idea of how it can be fixed. If we look back to the positive conversation between Mary and Peter in chapter 1, she had a solution in mind before she began, putting the recycling boxes safely out of the way. Let's say some neighbours are unhappy because Simon lights bonfires on summer weekends. Do they want to stop all bonfires? When would Simon's bonfires be less of a problem? Can everyone make an agreement and stick to it? Ensure that it's reasonable? How can the interests of all the neighbours and Simon be met? If you're thinking about having a tricky conversation, stop now and write down on your template or elsewhere, in a few words, what the problem is and what a solution might look like. Think only about the present and the future. Don't mention the past. Two, what might they do? Disagreements, disputes and conflicts arise between people who have a relationship, so you probably know something about the other person. We've established that we want everyone involved to keep control in a tricky conversation and that nobody should feel challenged or threatened. So now ask yourself how they might react initially when you approach fight, flight, freeze or please. In chapter 3, we looked at how you can work with these automatic reactions. So jot down how you would respond to any of those reactions in the situation you're thinking about now. Next, in your mind's eye, move on a bit in the conversation. Might they want to avoid any interaction? Or could they try to accommodate, compete, compromise or collaborate? Again, in chapter 3, we looked at how you can respond positively when others, and you, use such tactics. You can use our template to jot down how you might react positively to the different things you and the other person might say and do as the conversation develops. Just completing this simple exercise can make you much more confident about starting the conversation. Three, what do you say? The next step is to see how you might build the conversation. In chapter 6, we will go into more detail about how you might actually say things. There are 4 important steps in any successful tricky conversation. Few conversations will progress smoothly from step 1 to step 4, and you might only need step 1 if the other person says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realise." Or they could reveal that you've been doing something that has caused problems for them, and they start a new step 1. You might find the conversation moves between steps 2 and 3 several times before heading towards a solution. Any one of these routes is fine because what you're looking for is a solution, not a victory for one and a defeat for the other. Use the template to make notes about the 4 steps in your conversation. Step 1. Tell the other person about the situation. In many cases, this is extremely valuable because they might not even be aware that there's a problem. In chapter 6, we'll see how to explain what's happening without making them feel defensive. For example, "Simon, I've noticed that sometimes you have a bonfire on sunny afternoons. Step 2. Tell them how that affects you. A good word to use here is because. It indicates that you're being reasonable and invites the other person to respond positively. Continuing our example. That can be awkward for me because if I put my washing out, it gets smoky and sooty. Step 3. Ask them to comment. A good way to help someone feel that they are being listened to in a conversation is to ask what they think. Make it clear that you really want to know. You're not trying to ambush them or make them feel uncomfortable. For example, I'm wondering how we could get around this. What do you think? Step 4. Agree what to do next, including check-ins. There's no point in agreeing anything unless everyone understands what it will look like and you set up ways to check that the agreement is being kept. Example, after a plan has been decided. That sounds great. Can we check in to see how this is going for us both at the end of the month? Four. What could go wrong? The last job our template helps with is preparing for the worst possible outcome. What will you do if the other person storms off, shouts at you, starts weeping, becomes physically threatening? How will you cope if you dry up and forget everything you wanted to say? What if they come back with a strong argument against you? Conflict professionals often notice that the fear of what might happen is worse than the reality. Thinking about how to respond to possible worst cases increases your self-confidence and helps you make your points in a controlled and positive way. Each tricky conversation is unique, and it would be impossible to list every potential response here. Some general possibilities include: the other person becomes extremely emotional. You could say, you understand, this is a lot to think about, and suggest getting back together at a suitable time, after a few minutes or a couple of days, depending on the situation. Make sure that you do get back together. It might also be worth reassuring them that you do not mean to upset them. Tell them about the target outcome for the conversation that you jotted down in the first section of the Planning a Tricky Conversation template. The other person starts to argue. Now this is where the confidence from your planning comes in. Remember that you're looking for a solution, not a win-lose outcome, and take this opportunity to learn more about what they think, including the hidden influences on them that we discussed in Chapter 2. Help the other person give you more information by asking them to describe how they feel. Say more about the issue that's bothering them. Explain what exactly they disagree with, or tell you what they think a good solution might be. The most important information here is why they think they are right. When you know that, you can move the conversation on to talking in more detail about possible solutions that meet everyone's interests. You can also look out for points where you agree. For example, when talking to Simon about his bonfires, right, so we both say that people should be able to enjoy their garden. That's a good point to start a discussion on what enjoy their garden means to Simon and to his neighbours. The other person says or does something that you have not planned for. Once again, remember that you're looking for a solution, not a win-lose outcome. If they've stopped you in your tracks, be open and say that you need more time to think about what they've just said. Ask if you can stop now and meet again in a few minutes or a couple of days, depending on the situation. As we've already said, make sure that you do get back together. The other person threatens to become aggressive. Your safety is most important. Do not try to take the conversation further. You will keep control if you say something like, I can see that you're upset, I don't want to cause any problems, so let's stop now. Then leave the scene.